Welcome, everybody. As Rocky just said, we are Zooming this program, which means it will be available for recording, assuming everything works out. Please silence your cell phones and ask questions as we go, I was going to say. And because everybody here, I know, are active members, I usually would do a spiel about the December programs. But if for some reason you haven't looked at this, there's some great December programs. But today we're going to talk about schools of choice, and our speaker is Rocky, who is no stranger to us, one of our favorite presenters on everything from mosquitoes to exotic travel. Welcome, Rocky.
Hey, thank you. This is kind of like talking, you asked me to talk about cars, and I'll go all the way back and say who invented the wheel, and go forward from there as you talk about it. So as I got into this, Florence asked me to look into this and do some things, and so I did a bunch of research. And at least in my mind, you can't get to schools' choices until you go back and look at schools and how they started and how we ended up with the system we have, and we're a public system that we have. And then that morphs into the entire system that we have now. So that's kind of what we're going to do. We'll go back and start with an overview of the education system in the United States, how we got to where we are. We'll look at charter schools, private schools, which are different, and this is part of what Florence and I talked a little bit about, what the differences are between those, and then school choice policies and voucher systems at the end. And then all of that ends up into this location or the area we find ourselves in now, where there's all these discussions and going on in lots of school boards and lots of political entities around the nation on how this should go from here and so we'll try to get all the way into that too. So let's start back here. And of course, education was almost all a private affair. When when the country was first formed, of course, the population's very small. There's no organized system. Almost all learning was done in the home, and almost always from the women, from the wives. They did homeschooling, along with everything else that was on their plate to do. They did the homeschooling. Eventually, as the populations became more coalesced and there were population centers that formed up, then they ended up with schoolhouses and the old one-room. So how many people went to a one-room schoolhouse? Anybody here? My wife did at the time, went to a one-room schoolhouse, K through 12, in one building, one room. Everybody teaches down. So if you're in third grade, you help second and first grade. If you're in fifth grade, you do all that. That's how it ended up. We had teachers that then tried to serve that whole population from kindergarten to high school and beyond. Primarily, when we first started out with education, we had two subjects: reading and writing, and math. Those were the two topics. That was all that was taught, and that was all that was really deemed necessary. At the time, and this is at the beginning of the system, and then for a long time, anybody other than white Americans, males, were not allowed into the educational system. That was it. No one other than white American males were allowed in the educational system. No women, no foreign nationals, no thing. This is in the public education. They just, in most cases, prohibited by law. And and that didn't change until the 50s. Now, 1950s. Yeah, that's right. That's right. There were a lot of places around the world where you were not allowed. You had to have separate schools, and many times they were funded by other organizations. Yeah. In the US, around the US, there were places where you were not African Americans. African Americans, when were they allowed into public schools? Well, 70s maybe. The Civil Rights Act of 1966 attempted to break that free, but didn't work, even though the act was instituted. It took several more years till it finally worked. And the same thing was true of Native Americans. Where did Native Americans go to school? Native American schools, if there was one that was even established and do that. Not in the public schools. No. So, and you saw that kind of thing going on, and we all kind of forget that, even though most of us lived through the 60s and when all that was going on. So it's only been really recently that we've had this incorporated education system.
Teachers, and they had to be single.
Yeah, it was primarily like in the middle 1800s and onwards when we started to get more formal education, and they were women and they were single, and the list of requirements for them was about this long. Has anybody, you visited the schoolhouse at 40 Mile Point Lighthouse out, then they have a list of that out there for that school. And they were the same for a lot of those schools. No drinking, no partying, no this, no that, no, all this list of things that you had to do. So that's true. And that went on and on and on. And so they could teach, they couldn't go to school. Now, how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile that issue? Yeah.
To become a teacher, it was called a normal school. I'm still there.
Yeah.
Bradford, Ontario, and that's where she went to school.
Yeah.
Taught for years.
Yeah, kind of outside the normal system. Outside the system. Yeah, we've all kind of forgotten that period that had, and really not that long ago. After the American Revolution, there was a heavy emphasis on education at the time. It wasn't until, according to this research, 1870s, that's 100 years, that there really started to be free and public schools across what was then the United States of things. Private academies were everywhere. Who went to private academies? Yeah, wealthy only. Wealthy only could afford to go to private academies. However, you look by 1900, the US population had what? One of the highest literacy rates in the world by 1900. Because other countries didn't have any systems either, where they would send young people to school. It was all money. If you had money, you got education. If you didn't have any money, you got no education. When the US started having education for those students after 1870s, then we started to bypass all these other countries at that time. So here's some pictures, a continuing thing. We've all seen these as we read about it, or we've read novels, or we've read history books about what it was like to go to school at those times, and it was pretty strange. Now, this is kind of a philosophical statement, the first one up there. It's often seen as a means to deliver equality. In other words, establishing these schools tried to raise the people up with no money to give them the ability to compete with the people who had money. So this, from the very beginning, education was often seen as a way to try to level the playing field. Go ahead, Ron. Oh, yeah, if you look back in all those discussions that happened in the Revolutionary War times, revolution would be not before the war. The discussions they had amongst themselves was, how do we do that? And what was the original answer? Don't let anybody make decisions that was not educated, because that's not going to work. So that was the rule when they started. But they noted that we can't go on like this. We have to develop an educated constituency if this place is going to survive, this whole thing. So they knew both sides of that coin. Now, the U.S. went to this situation where now, and from the federal mandate, it is compulsory. You have to go to school, right? K to 12, have to go to school. We're going to talk more about that compulsory part later when we get into where we're at now in the situation our education system is in now, and this compulsory part, how that's actually working out. And schools were to be funded by the federal, state, local levels, taxes, things. They were supposed to be free in there. And so, and by and large, they are. So I guess you can say that pretty clearly. Now, one of the things that's always been this way is the policies, the guidance, the curriculum is set by local school boards. Are we having any fun with that now, Tom? Huh? You're out, right? He's out. We no longer have a spy in the midst. But we see that throughout the U.S., what's happening inside local school boards now around the U.S. and how that's influencing the education systems. So do we now have a homogeneous education system in the U.S.? No. I mean, it's radically different in all parts of Michigan, in all parts of every state, and in all parts of the U.S. Totally different. Totally different. So then you come out of these locally run places and go to college, and what happens? Yeah, you have all these competing educated people who now are in a place where there's a whole new set of standards. And it's supposed to be a standard. And some of them can't even touch the standard with the education they got in up through their high school. And others are saying, wait a minute, I've already done all this. And so that's where we find ourselves. It's really kind of interesting. The goals are there at the bottom. And you see this all the time. It's not that you learn these rote things. You learn that in 1861 this happened. You learn supposedly how to think, how to critically think, how to talk, how to problem solve, and how to be a little creative. Is that happening? Not so much, right? Not so much. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. This is kind of the flow. Now, it looks like a mess on there when you look at this, but on one side of this, on the right-hand side of this chart, you see the grade level. Now, start at the bottom from pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and work your way up through the 7th year of postgraduate work in college. And on the left-hand side, you see the age. And so it kind of gives you an idea how generically in the U.S. education flows. And we're all pretty familiar with this. Junior high schools can be a range of, 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 9, 8, 9, 7, and 8. That people make those designations in their local school areas. So it's not exactly standardized across the way. But this is, generally speaking, how things go. Now, over the centuries from the start, 1776 on, we've had all kinds of changes in our system. This thing in blue is a quote that I saw in one of the articles I was reading, and I think it's really pretty good. So you should really read the blue quote and see if you agree or disagree with what that says, but I think that's probably pretty accurate. It's social factors and cultural shifts have caused our system to evolve into what we have now. Not academics, not science, not people who study this. It's the social and cultural context that's caused these changes. And political drivers, you know, and why politics? Because the money. That's where the money comes from, and that's how politics gets injected into education. This is a general outline. Generally speaking, you're talking 20 to 30 students. I had 32 in my graduating class, total, whole school, 32. So there's, yeah, you know, small town type of thing. I was with 19 or 20 of them from kindergarten to graduation in the school. So you're seeing 20 to 30. Are now 30 people in a classroom now. Is that a lot of kids or a small number of kids? That's a lot. Yeah. Try not to have 30 people. 20, not so bad. You know, 20 is a widespread. I taught at two or three colleges and at the Naval War College, and all the academic research says no more than 14. Get more than 14, your span of control as a teacher or as a moderator, you can't do it. You cannot keep control. You cannot moderate it. It's too many people. How many 14 people classrooms do we have? 0 probably in a public school system, which is why we're going to talk later on about some of these other school systems. There are standards developed, and what's happening now to the standards? Getting whacked, right? All these standards are getting whacked. Everything on math, on reading, and science, everything's getting whacked. We're going to talk more about that as we go along. What does that do? It drives people to look for alternate forms of education. Okay, this is kind of an interesting thing. This is now lowest reading proficiency in 30 years. Most seniors read at a 5th or 6th grade level. More than 50% of the seniors in the U.S. But how do we know that? Because we used to test them. All right? Do we test anymore? It's going down and down and down. All right? Oh, we can't test them. That's not a good way to measure how good people are at what they do. You know, besides, you're really, you know, discriminating. Now, this is a pretty interesting, the chart on the right there, if you look at that, you've got 2 lines there. You've got graduation rates, high school graduation rates, dark blue line, light blue line, SAT scores. What does that show you? You dumb down the schools so you can get people to graduate and they don't know anything. That's what the chart showed. Yeah, so they don't know anything, but they don't know what they're used to. You know, it's really, really, really gone down. So how do we fix that problem? Don't require SATs, right? How many schools have you heard about, read about, things, colleges that no longer require standard test scores? Oh, well, that discriminates. Again, so you can't have test scores. So now how do colleges know the capability of the students they're getting? They don't. They don't. That's why you get all these remedial courses. People show up. Okay, here's the kind of the recap of how we got to where we're at in this thing, how we have the public school system that we do. And then why did that lead to the development perhaps of other choices and other opportunities and other things? And so this is a recap here, and you can kind of see we've talked about pretty much every one of these things. Now, here's part of the problems we're having right now. And this also leads us into these schools of choice. We, all over the United States, have increasing diversity of all of our populations. That's a fact, just happening everywhere. And that's increasing diversity racially, and economically, in education, every category that you can imagine. The diversity is higher than it was before, and it's increasing. But now we have what? Anti-diversity campaigns. We don't want to address diversity. That's wrong. So that's where we find this conflict in school systems inside this thing, is they're trying to handle this diversity that they see in their population, and yet if they even say that word, the political part that we saw earlier can cost them money, all the things. So it's a real problem we have. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but a little bit now we should probably talk about it. Here is technology integration. How do you handle cell phones now in the classroom? Yes or no? There's all kinds of things. There's a lot of schools now that are trying to do that. When you check into school in the morning, you check your cell phone, and 2 or 3 times during the day, you're allowed access to your phone, but not in the classroom. You don't get the phone. So there's schools trying to do that, and it works. But who complains about that? Parents. Oh, my kid has to have their phone when? All the time, because I may want to get hold of them. So even though that's most of the people who are educators or worried about the school system know that you can't do that, the local school boards are under a lot of pressure from parents who say, look, you can't do that. So this thing. The other big thing coming up is artificial intelligence. How do you handle artificial intelligence? Anybody here use artificial intelligence? Okay. Well, we do it whether we know it or not, but I'm talking about specifically. You go into GPT or Gemini or Copilot or one of these things and use it. So you're doing that? Yeah, you should. You should get in and mess around and play around with those things and figure out what they can do for you, because they can do things for you. But they can also do things for students. And so it's really a dilemma. When I taught at the Naval War College, we had 2 exam periods we did trimesters, and in the trimester you had a midterm and a final. And on each exam there were 3 questions. 3 essay questions. On each exam, you had to answer all 3. You were allowed 1 typewritten page, and we found out after the first time we had to specify the font and the margins of that, because you got 2-pitch stuff. But everything was open book. Every exam, everything, you could use anything you wanted to do this exam. You could go to the library, you could use your computer, you could do the thing. But did we have Chat GPT then? No. That would be nearly impossible now to do that kind of an exam. Because grading the exams, 14 people in the things, automatic bell curve as soon as you started reading them. I mean, it was easy. Grading was easy. As you start reading them, and people either get it or they don't. And you lay out these 14 and start stacking them up. And I mean, in 20 minutes, you got them stacked. So, but with ChatGPT, somehow you got to figure out, is this person able to write a good ChatGPT prompt? Because that's going to be what's important, because everybody's going to be, trust me, everybody's going to be using these pure GPT things or equivalents, these AI work engines. You're going to be using them. So how good a product you get out is, like everything else in the world, is going to depend on how good an input you put in. But if you're now a teacher in the 6th grade and you give them a writing assignment, how do you handle that? Really, really hard. So there's all kinds of scrambling going on in school systems on how to handle this, but it's coming. There's going to be no way to block it. It's impossible. So somehow there has to be a system set up to do that. And then at the bottom there, funding and equity debates. We have this all the time, this equity versus equality. Is equity and equality equal? Do they mean the same thing? No, they don't. So when people talk about how we fund, what we do, what the goal is, then is really, like all things, words matter. Which exact word you use, which phrase you use matter, because the funding will specify certain things. And whether they try to shoot for equity or they try to shoot for equality, two different goals, two dramatically different goals. These are the fights that are going on in school boards and classrooms and in politics and community. So we're in, as the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. And that's one of their, they don't call them, they call them Chungyus, but it's a, okay, so that leads us to this. Why do we have now these other things? And this kind of gets more to what Florence was interested in, is how do we get these other things, and who are they and what do they do? The first other kind of a school we're going to talk about, and this came about, all of these other alternatives came about because of the apparent failure by some parents' ideas and some people's of the public school system. So these schools came about to address that apparent failure. And so the structure, philosophy, and impact of these schools is different. Now, charter schools are public schools. They're under contract. They're essentially an arm of the public school system. But they're not governed or run by the architecture of the public school system. So they're funded by public funds. Their charter or their goals and their whole curriculum can be overseen, but it's not overseen by the same group. School board doesn't get a vote. The school board doesn't get a vote. How are the leadership team of charter schools picked? That's one. It certainly is. If you're a huge donor, how are they picked? And the answer was the largest donation. Yeah, or the largest donation gets a real big vote in who is on the board, but they are appointed. Are school board members appointed, generally speaking, appointed? No, they're elected. They are elected. So theoretically, there's a guy, there's somewhat of a guideline or a safety net there on school boards because they're elected, but charter schools, they're appointed. So can the overseer, the head person who's designated, also appointed, kind of load that gun however he or she wants? Absolutely. They get, and who they pick to be on the leadership team is going to dramatically influence how that charter school works. Yes, Ron. The question is, do charter schools have to meet the same standards or requirements? And the answer is no, they do not. How about that? Now, generally speaking, people consider their standards to be higher. Are they? No, not necessarily. Yeah, go ahead, Ron. Okay, the question is, how do you handle specific groups in the school, like handicapped, disabled, learning disabled things? Who gets into charter schools? How do you determine your student body? How do they look and pick the people? No, no. How do you get considered? You have to apply. Yeah, so they have an application and do this. And then who decides who gets in? The school. Do they have the same standards as public schools? No. Are they under the same requirements? No. Do they have to take X percentage, X this, do that, have a program to satisfy this sub-element of their population? No. So there's a term called cherry picking. We all know that term from various sources and references, and this is often used in this discussion about charter schools, and we'll talk about that in private schools here too, with cherry picking. It sometimes happens that charter schools appear to be cherry picking because they get to determine who's in and who's out. And they don't have to use the same criteria. They don't have to satisfy the requirements of this group. Can that make it good for the charter school students?
Good.
Well, in other words, yeah. Diversity, do they get that? No. Individual focus and a more homogeneous level of performance? Yes. So why do some parents flock to charter schools?
Kids from diversity.
Because part of it is that, to protect their kids from that, but they see an opportunity there. Okay. They see an opportunity where there's more individual attention, class sizes are smaller, overall performance level is higher, therefore the students are going to get a better education because of all those things, because it's not diluted by diversity, other programs, special ed, all these other things that take away from that. So that's the dilemma of this, pros and cons and all these things. They're theoretically, nonprofit organizations. Do they get funded by taxpayer money? Yes. Do they take donations? Yes. So as Mike is pointing out, can their curriculum, their leadership and things be influenced by donations? Sure. Absolutely. I read a little article, something had nothing to do with this, but it talked about lobbying in the US. The article was about lobbying, and it said lobbying in the US by in any other country is corruption. Wow, if you really think about it, that's not far off track. And the same concept, the same idea now you see arising in these nonprofit organizations that are not under the same rules and don't have to perform to the same and they don't have to do that. Now in Michigan, we do have charter schools, and they're called here public school academies. That's the name for them in Michigan. I didn't know that until I started doing this research. And there on the little chart down there, you see where they're at in Michigan. That's the layout. How many here? How many close to here? How many anywhere close to here? Yeah, it is true. Is it a charter school or a private school? Oh, funded by the state. Oh, well, they don't show up in the, well, it could be, they didn't meet the criteria for this. This is from the Michigan education, so they obviously don't have everything in here either. So, a charter school? Yeah, but it was before me. So, Montessori's private. Well, we're going to talk about that. That's a different kettle of fish. Now, have you heard this term, magnet schools? Were either of those a magnet school, do you know? No. I lived in Texas for a bunch of years, courtesy of the Air Force, and their charter schools are almost all called magnet schools. So you have music, you have math, you have writing, you have this. So that school specializes in one of those things. And so people from a wide area that are interested in that kind of specificity go to those charter schools, and they're called magnet schools, and they have those kinds of things. So you can go ahead.
He went out Dizzle, it looks like.
Oh yeah, I don't know. Does anybody know what that town? That's like Eagle River or whatever the name of the town is up there. Yeah. It's kind of surprising. And really, what does it take to have one of these? You got to have people with money who form an organization to form the nonprofit to publish or to go to the state to try to get the money to fund it. It could be. Or somehow associated, yeah. It may not have needed it a bunch of money. There has to be somebody with enough money to get these people together, form the organization. You've got to have a building. Now, you can petition the government, the state government, to get facilities, but they may or may not give them to you, depending on what they have, what the thing is. So there is a place you can go inside Michigan and inside states to get loans for facilities, very low interest loans for facilities for charter schools. In some cases, you can get grants for things, but if you want a facility, you just can't go. When this is one of the cons, is if you have your local government says, well, we're going to have a charter school and they're taking Bingham School. Okay. How does that affect the rest of the school system at the time? So that's one of the cons you see when people are talking about developing charter schools and things, is where do they get their teachers? They're hired under a totally different system. Totally different system. So are their incomes typically higher or lower than public school teachers?
Lower.
Lower here.
Private schools, we're going to get to private schools. Private schools are almost always lower. Charter schools, not always. Not always. Because they're what? Government funded, but they're run by a different person. And the amount of money you pay them is not under a schedule like the state is. So they get X amount of money for their school, and how that leader determines to spend it can possibly lead to higher. And we'll talk about why it's lower with private schools when we get there. They do receive government funding, so they do get some kind of overlook. They get private donations, and then we just have been talking quite a bit about their variability of access. And that's one of the cons. Okay. Copper Island Academy.
Excellent.
All right. This gives you some idea where they can get their money. Here. One of the worries about these schools is there's not really any oversight. Once you give them the money, there's not really any oversight of what goes on inside the organization. So a lot of people worry about that. A lot of taxpayers, because they say, look, my money's going in there, but I have no idea how they're spending it, how they're doing it. There's no reporting. There's none of these things. Go ahead, Brian.
And I know one in Bristol Academy is sponsored by community college, and I understood that all of them were that way.
Ooh, no, I didn't read that anywhere.
I know the one in Bristol Academy is sponsored by a community college.
I didn't see that anywhere, but it could well have been or be the case. It does vary by state to state because of how charter schools work, and so it could well be that they're associated with a particular college, with a university or a community college on things. So it's which then makes them, in many cases, more appealing to some students when you do that. Now, it's interesting here, though, they cannot collect local tax revenues like a public school can. They cannot have a bond issue. They cannot do that. They cannot. So how do you make up for that? Private. You have to do fundraisers, or you have to locate somebody with pockets and get the money. Which then does what? Influences how you do business, what the pull might be, what the draw might be. So this is, it can be a suspect area. Yes? Somebody? Question? Okay. Once again, all of these things, it's the variability of access is a serious issue. Now, one of the things that's touted as a real positive thing is that they can be very much more innovative because they are not subject to the same curriculum development, the same goals, the same things as public schools. So they can pretty much decide what they want to do. They can jump the pool on AI, on tech, on things. They can put tons more emphasis, if they so desire, they can do that. They can stop this particular phase of learning and use all the funds and all the money to do so. They can be very, very innovative. They can react much more quickly. Their parental base is much more homogeneous in things than public schools. So they don't get the dramatic blowback on one side or the other that you get in the public school area. So in a lot of cases they have, I think we talked about this, their boards are appointed, not elected. Keeps coming up, equity and access. And inclusion and fairness, most people would say, no, not. You know, that's kind of the common thing. Now, here we talked again here about the here it uses the term cream skimming, same idea, cherry picking, and they're talking about that. And when you're competing for resources, and so another problem that happens is you're funded as a public school system in Michigan by the student. So much money per student. Yeah. So if this school pulls out, and these are now what? Are they public school students in this charter school? No, no, because it's run by a nonprofit organization. So they get their funding, but that's not the same type of thing. And they're not public school. So, but these students now, they're gone from the public school. So what happens to the funding of the public school? Oof, down it goes. So this is one of the real difficulties with for the whole community is how you reconcile this within the community. It's not clearly one-to-one when this money is taken away or these students are taken away. It's not a one-to-one trade-off. So you have to, the real dilemma is to try to figure out what that impact really is when you do that. Really opened my, I didn't know anything about this really until when they had this workshop a few years ago. Tom was on the board back then when they were trying to figure out bond issues for Ella White, and this was, I don't know, quite a few years ago. Got 50 or 60 of us in the room, gave us all got briefings. Anybody else on that group committee? Got a briefing from whatever consultants they hire to do this and how to do all that things. And that's where I really learned a lot about what goes on inside these schools. And in Michigan, by law, by lawsuit, had to readjust how they funded schools back per student to try to make it more equitable. So they did it, but then what did they do? They used the standards before they were to do this to set the new standards. So the schools that were getting less money before the change got less money after the change. And the schools that got a lot of money before the change got a lot of money after the change. So essentially they had this whole big lawsuit. They were told to fix things and it didn't do anything. It essentially, changed nothing as far as the distribution of money between school districts. So this is, and we don't have, as you said, some of you were here when Bingham School was a charter and I was not. So I don't know if there was an influence in the community or what the thought process was. This is the only chart I could find, and this is from the Federal Education Department, U.S. Education Department, and this is their estimation. This is about 2 or 3 years old, this data. Charter school performance compared to public schools. 46%, the same. 37% worse than public, and 17%, only 17% better performance on standardized tests, where everybody across all systems taking the same test. So if you only looked at this chart, you would say, wow, is it really worthwhile in your community to have a charter school for a 17% rate of return? You got a chance at 17%, but you also have a bigger chance, 37%. It's going to be worse. People don't think that at all. The total concept is, oh, smaller school, better teachers, this is going to be a lot better. This says no, it's not. So it's kind of an interesting recap to that. Private schools, and this is a little different. This is where Montessori fits in along with a bunch of other schools. Most of the private schools, and by most it's higher than 50%, are religiously oriented private schools. There are secular private schools, other academies that are not charter schools. They're private academies. Some of them have of these other secular ones have some religious affiliation, but they're not a religious school. And they try to promote a more diverse cultural understanding. If you look at the ratings of schools in the state of Michigan, the top 10 schools are all private schools in the state of Michigan, and they're all downstate. They're all big schools and they're all downstate. And those, if you look at the rankings, they're all private schools. Faith-based schools, of which we have several in Alpena, that's where you find out in these private schools, the pay for teachers is less. Always. Because they're doing their teaching for a different reason. They do that. And so their funding is less. Is their education necessarily lower? No, because these teachers really, really care about what they're doing and why. So sometimes the performance works out to be even better. The Montessori approach, and I didn't know enough about Montessori to understand what was really going on, but they're everywhere around. You see Montessori schools. All things, and they're kind of interesting. They're self-directed, self-paced learning, and lots of activities, both in classroom and out of classroom. And the idea is holistic, is to build the whole person concept. So it's an interesting concept. Does anybody know anyone that's gone or had people go to a Montessori school? Yeah. What was it good, their experience, or no? Yeah, I've never known anyone that it was friends with that had kids that gone to a Montessori, so I don't have any. Yes. Ah, yeah. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then there's prep schools, and these are designed, a lot of times these are associated with specific universities. A lot of times they're military oriented, and they're prep schools for the academies, or they're places where they send problem students. So you see these preparatory academies, a lot of times you could substitute the word problem student for preparatory, and it would fit. It would fit the concept of the things. A lot of the focus is on discipline and character development. Do we have what? The question is, do we have any prep schools up here? No, not in our area. There are some, but they're all, again, the huge predominance of private schools are in the belt, very southern belt of Michigan. This is the Montessori layout. And the idea is to start at the very youngest age, and you go all the way through adulthood, and this is what their concept is of how they're developing the fully reasoning adult, how they do that. And so help me do it myself. That's the young people, up to kindergarten. And it's very much more independently oriented. And then they develop the reasoning mind, help me to think with you. In other words, collaborative work, how to work as a group, how to work together as a group. And then how can I help you out there? So this is really, if every problem was as easy to solve as its concept, this would be really good. If you could really do this as they are describing it from left to right, it's an awesome thing. But we know that reality doesn't always reflect what you write down on paper as what your goals are. And so over the years, the whole Montessori system has struggled in a lot of areas and a lot of things. But they're still a very viable organization, a lot of schools out there. Their primary source of revenue from private schools is tuition. And it can be very, very high. There's private schools in the lower part of Michigan where tuition is $72,000 a year for the students. That's a lot of money for an elementary level student. I mean, donations play a much more significant role in private schools, and then that can affect your program offering, your scholarships, and your whole goal setting. is where do you get these donations and how do those work? And then endowments are super important to private schools, and those are long-term, estate-driven. It allows them continuity, allows them to look to the future and be relatively certain they're going to still exist 2 or 3 years from now. And you're seeing more and more endowment fundraising from everybody in the world out there. Every organization is now trying to tap into endowment fundraising. This is where they get their money for private schools. Now you can see here this whole brown part that you see is a lot of that's from endowment and from prior donations. In other words, these schools have a huge pot of money that they are not dipping into. They're living off the investments, operating off the investments of this pile of money. And a lot of these, especially in the southern part of Michigan and other states in their population centers, were schools that were endowed by some very rich person who formed the school. And they gave them enough money that the school, as long as they're not stupid, can go on forever. They have enough money in their endowment pot because there's enough money that 30% of their yearly requirement can come out of that fund, and it doesn't diminish the fund at all. Fund stays there. So that's kind of thing. And you see that gifts and donations, 12%, that's pretty low. That's a pretty low percentage. And this is the breakdown. You see there enrollment trends, 78% of private school students were in a religious school of some kind. Now, contrary to the charter schools, which we saw were kind of even and a huge 37% were, not true with private schools. Pretty much across the board, they outperform public schools in every category. And that's pretty much true. So in many cases, this paying $20,000, if you have the $20,000 a year for tuition, pays off for the people that can afford that, because their performance level is routinely and consistently higher than public schools. So we think it's the same for charter schools. It's not. The performance level. This is a breakdown by religious category of the private schools. Huge amount, Roman Catholic, by far. Lutheran, pretty large, also. And then a breakdown of all the various religions. Jenny, my wife Jenny, went to a Roman Catholic, to a Catholic school until she was a junior in high school, and then school closed. That thing, because she's in a town of a -4 population. And, but they had a school, because all the farmers and the whole area, 99.9% Catholic. So all the farm kids went to this school until she was a junior. So she finished high school at a public school. And she had good things to say about both of them. You know, she was really glad she got to go to the year of public school before going to college, but she really thought the education was a lot better in the private school. Same kinds of things. Now, we talked about this just a second ago. The academic performance is higher in the private. Equity and access issues. Is it equity and access, equality or equity higher or lower than public schools? Lower. A lot of money, very, very restrictive. So equity and access in private schools, really, really high, really thing, but that's why they're private. Lots of socioeconomic disparities because it costs a lot of money to go to private schools. Impact on public schools, pretty much the same as charter schools. When you pull these people out of the public schools, then you not only do you lose that individual funding, but who are these parents that just pulled their kids out? Movers and shakers, all right? They are the movers and shakers in that area And so now you've taken these decision makers that have a lot of influence and you put them in a different place. So that's an impact that you don't really see quite often or don't recognize. This is our local. Here's the local 3 religious schools. And this is information that's, I don't know how old. You know, I wasn't able to tell when this was developed. I went to each school place and got their information. And you can see that, and here's what happens. Emmanuel Lutheran, members cheap. That's really cheap for a year, this a year's tuition. So what do people do? They join Emmanuel Lutheran, get their kids in the school. When their kids finish school, gone. Happens all the time, you know. Not as big a spread for All Saints. Not quite as, so you probably don't see the same impact. And then I'm not even sure what Berean Christian School. I wasn't able to, I think it might be Seventh-day Adventist. I think that's what it is, but all of their documentation doesn't ever say that anywhere in any of the things that I can find about them. But I think that that's a Seventh-day Adventist school. Just, yeah, in Alpena. Yeah, see, that's the same thing. I said, oh, what about Berean? What? You don't know if it's associated with them? Yeah, I don't know. If you, you know, I tried to Google their affiliation and nothing came up. You know, I couldn't find anything. And you know, it's probably easier to find. I didn't spend a ton of time drilling down to try to find it. But when I saw that it was there, I was surprised. And because I'd never heard of it and anybody I knew had never heard of it. So that's interesting that they have that school here. Strengths and weaknesses, and we've covered almost all of these as we've worked our way through here, do that. Again, the things that people look for in private schools, there's a much stronger community and discipline in the private school, much stronger. How easy is it to eject a student from private school? Boom, see ya. Okay. How easy in the public school? It can take a long time, you know. It can take a long time and be very frustrating to do that. Access to resources, once again, that's a two-edged sword sometimes, access to resources. If you're one of these $27,000 a year private schools, then your access to resources is really high because you've got a lot of money per student to put in your facilities, your resources, your instructor. If you're $1,100 a year here, what are you counting on? You're counting on the enthusiasm and the dedication of the teachers. So it's a balance there. High tuition costs, lack of diversity. Absolutely. That's why a lot of people want a private school. So they don't have to do diversity. That's the whole thing. Some limited options, particularly with religious schools, there's a lot of stuff that's prohibited that they don't teach. They don't want to teach. And a potential for social exclusion. Once again, two issues there, the diversity, and then also 78% of these are religious schools. And so you do have that whole other side of that where it's not taught or given. Voucher systems and other things. There's all kinds of ways to pay for these schools, private, charter, and magnet programs. And we've talked about some of these. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go. Anybody ever heard of these education savings accounts? Yeah, a lot of people have. Very common. Michigan has the ability to do. It's one of the states that has that to do that. Education tax credits. Heard of that? Similar, it's something, if you make out the thing and you have an eligible person under the age of 18, there is a separate deduction, which I never knew. Maybe it didn't exist when I had high school students, but if you're paying money, of course, I didn't have a private school. If you're in private school, you're paying this money, you're paying tuition, you can deduct that up to $5,000 in some cases, and depending on the state, $10,000 a year. That's a lot of deduction. So that's another possibility on what it makes it appealing for these private schools. And then voucher programs. We hear this now, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but that's very controversial now about having voucher programs where essentially what those amount to is you take the amount of money in a public school that's allocated per student and you let the parents spend it wherever they want. That's essentially the voucher program in a nutshell. Well, very controversial. We'll talk a little bit about that. Magnet programs we've done. Open enrollment. Does Michigan have open enrollment? Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. You're pretty much allowed with the school systems. The school still, it's not mandatory that they let you in, but they'd have to have a pretty strong case for not doing it.
We advertise every year
That you are open enrollment. Yeah, yeah, it's, you can imagine individual cases when you wouldn't take little Johnny. You know, once you find out who little Johnny really is, you can imagine cases where you wouldn't do that. Okay. Here's the evolution of these ESA programs, and it started years and years ago, and it's really interesting. You went through this whole development. It took 20 years, almost 40 years to these things to come to fruition. You can use that money to do any of these things. And it's interesting, you can use it for tutoring services. It doesn't have to be, you can do that if you're in public school transportation assistance, and other things. These are all things that can be covered under your ESA. There's two basic kinds. There's called Coverdell. Those are a tax advantage investment account. And then state-run programs. And actually, Michigan has a state-run ESA program where you can put your money in there. It's tax beneficial up to the age of 18 for the students. This is primarily for kindergarten to high school. And this kind of gives you an idea of the differences between those two. And really, these 529 accounts, those are, once again, favor the wealthy. There's really no limit on what you can invest and do that. But it's really focused on the more wealthy individuals. Now, this is kind of the thing, and it says there that states with any program, and it doesn't have Michigan. Well, Michigan has one. They have a program that runs in here, but you can see it's not universal. There's a whole bunch of states out there that don't have any program. This is kind of an interesting chart here. This is the school choice thing. And so the dark blue, states with private schools, okay, and public charter school laws. And the key there is laws. One thing that Michigan doesn't have a lot of is laws governing these various things in here. Public charter school and no private school, that's the light blue. Private school choice and no public charter school. So you're covering all these various options of, you know, private schools, yes, charter schools, yes, both, no, things. It kind of, you know, once again, there's no continuity across the U.S. at all. This is that tax credit, Schedule 3, 440. That's where, if a person was ever interested, that's where you file your tax credit. Here's the pros, I guess you would say, for vouchers. Of course, the key word there is aim. They aim to expand educational options, letting students, actually it's not, it's the parents who are looking for this, and to promote competition. I'm not sure that that's very valid in the thing, but these are the goals that you see when you do that. It does help with choice. There's no doubt about that. If you had vouchers, it does increase the choice. Once again, funding equity, it's the same exact argument, logic that we've talked about with charter schools and public schools, is if you give this money away, it's gone. And so then how does that affect your public schools? And then once again, what are the accountability of all this? Where's this money going? What's the things? It's a wide open thing. Does anybody know what the Michigan position is, Michigan voters' position is on vouchers? Been defeated 3 times. Been on the ballot 3 times, been defeated 3 times in the state of Michigan. So right now, and I don't know the dates, it wasn't in the thing, but it's been defeated in votes 3 times. So there's not a lot of, at least at these prior times, there wasn't a lot of interest in considering vouchers. Ron. Oh, the question is, who are the main promoters of vouchers? And I think it's the same people who are interested in private schools and charter schools. It's that whole same group of people who, for some reason, are disenchanted with the public system, and that's a way for them to have the money to have a better choice. So I think it's exactly the same people. It's just a way for them to fund themselves to be able to do it. We'll say that again, Ron. Ron says it seems like that was a DeVos prior, and I think that that's true. She particularly has been pushing that for years and years and years, and essentially so far it hasn't worked in Michigan. So here's kind of the breakdown of where we're at and what we're looking at. Hang on, I'm gonna grab a sip of this, let you look at this very simple chart. It's simple. It's a very simple chart. So let's go through kind of a couple of 3 of these little blocks here. If you look at the one with the pie chart there, it's kind of interesting. This is a prediction by 2030, which is when? Not very far. And the 2030 sounds like, it's way out there. Nope, it's not way out there. Now, this is a prediction that 50%, only 50% of eligible students will be in public schools by 2030. Now, it's not Michigan specific, that's the US. But man, that's a dramatic shift, dramatic shift in that. We talked about what's the future school going to look like. Yeah. The green one, homeschooling. Yeah, homeschooling. Once again, if you don't have standard testing, how do you measure how good homeschooling is doing? No, we, the total population of the ER, have been going away from any kind of measurement of anything. But in education, we've been moving away and away and away from public, from standardized testing. So you have no way of measuring what's going on. These looming enrollment cliff, and this is about the about the same idea as the pie chart there is that the number of graduating seniors is going down and down and down and down and down. Now, one of the things we see here, we talked about earlier about education being compulsory. What's the attendance rate now of kids in school? Not good, right? Why? Because the parents don't care. And there's no enforcement. So school is what? Compulsory, but what? If you have no enforcement method, no thing, you say, okay, you've got to come in to the office. Who comes in? Nobody. Who cares? What are you going to do? What are you going to do to me? So, and that's only going to get worse and worse and worse. There you go. So we're facing all kinds of issues. Now, we talked about AI, but here, if you look at these useful school subjects, what's at the top here? Math and English. What did we start out teaching in 1776? Math and English. The two things you needed to know the most. So the most thing. What does any student in the world not want to learn? Math and English. How about algebra? How many people have kids who said, I'll never use this? Anybody? I was a math major, so. But algebra is not math. Algebra is logic. And so that's the difference there. That's why people should study algebra. It's not about math. It's about learning how to solve problems. But anyway, you see these, everybody agrees that these are important. But we have no enforcement ability, no way to make this happen. So we're looking not so good.
You know, that you're not getting cooperation. That person does go make a difference.
Yes.
But it's hard to.
Yeah, you don't have a hammer. No, there's no hammer. And if you have no hammer, Tom,
Consequence to the parents eventually?
the question is there if you have an issue, is there a consequence?
But this is a lot of. Well, you know, when you go to the legal system, you know, if you say I'm doing something wrong, and I say no, I'm not. Well, then you have to hire a lawyer, attorney, or the prosecutor's got to decide to take the case. You know, and so stuff like that. So it's very difficult to enforce. But I mean, we have this lady that goes out and knocks on the door and says your kids are, and hopefully that, you know, she doesn't wield a big stick, but she at least reminds them that it's very difficult. It's kind of like, you know what it reminds me of? I'm on the planning commission for township, and it's like blight. It's like what constitutes blight, and how hard are you going to fight to get rid of it? It's kind of that same thing. How hard are you going to? You know, it's important though.
Yeah.
But some judge has to.
It's also kind of like enforcing speed limits. If nobody's gonna grab a speed limit, you can't enforce it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really tough problem. You know, that's why I bring it up. I mean, I don't think on the horizon, there's no good solution, and you only see it getting worse. Because if there's no consequence, then there's no consequence. And so the word gets around very quickly that there's no consequence. And so if anybody else is even remotely feeling like they don't want to play, they know that there's no consequence. And so I think these are all slopes we don't like. All these things we see are on slopes that we don't like.
Lunch buddies. Or most children, their father wasn't in the picture, so you just go have lunch with them, talk to them. And this problem with this little boy was truancy, and this mom
Didn't care.
well, she was working and she
Yeah.
was trying, I mean, she was trying to make a living. And just was, she'd get home from work and she was tired, and some days, he didn't get up on his own.
Yeah.
Just stayed home.
Yeah, it's like all things. If their solution was easy, we would have already done it. That's so many problems are that way. You look at them and say, well, this is hard. And if there were easy solutions, we have a lot of smart people involved in these things. If there were easy solutions, somebody would have been on it. And so we're really in a tough bind. Here's the key things of Michigan. You see there the constitutional ban public funding of private schools. This is one of the reasons why vouchers are difficult, because that's a way of funding private schools, is if you take state money and allow that to do. So that's a difficulty. They've voted several different times, lack of school vouchers. Michigan does have other options. We've seen that. They have ESAs. We have these academies. Tax credits are out there. We looked at, so there's a lot of things out there. There's a lot of ongoing debate. And Mackinac Center, if you read any of their stuff they put out, they talk about this stuff all the time and things. And then Detroit Free Press always has got articles going all the time. And yeah, Ridge, Michigan. So we've seen this in nearly every one of the kinds of schools. Equitable access, that's an issue with any one of these schools that's not public, is how, what's equitable and who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what? Well, if the state gets to decide, then it's no longer a private school. So all these things. The big issue a lot of the times is strong community involvement is vital unless the strong community involvement's on the wrong side. And then that's not necessarily well, I shouldn't say wrong, because that says what side I'm on. So it's very complex. We all know that. It's a very, very complex issue. We've got a historical and cultural issues behind us that are coming forward now. There's going to be a lot of innovative school choices as we go into, if you're going to have to adapt to technology and AI. You can't go on with the same model we have now. Not going to work. It's not going to work. So somehow we have to try to jump the curve here and get in front of that. And then once again, somehow we all who care have to try to make sure that there's some mechanism that looks at equity and effectiveness of this whole program, so you don't become even more stratified and even more separated because of how you let the school system develop, which is easy to do, easy to get that stratification. So any other questions that we haven't covered or things? I don't have any answers. Tom does. So if you got questions, we got, Tom's been through the mill. He knows these things. Anybody? Yo.
Any, down the loss of diversity and equity programs in the future, in terms of enrollments, minorities and things?
The question is, in looking at this data, did we see anything about loss of enrollment in universities or other schools because of this lack of diversity or anti-diversity programs? And the answer is sure, it's everywhere. It's in every place you want to see. People are writing about it, but the whole concept has not been going on long enough to see the data. You know what I'm saying, Mike? In other words, we have these concepts, we have this blowback, but we haven't really had a long enough period of time yet to be able to measure the data and say, yeah, look, that's really the case.
Current population was 10 to 12%. If you look up high-end jobs like lawyer and doctor, there's 5%.
Yeah.
Black. When, you know, it's half of what you would sort of expect by the demographic. If it was 8, 9, you would think nothing of it, but it's 5.
Right.
When you're looking at a 10, 12% of our population, I
Yeah.
don't know how you explain it by discrimination.
Well, I mean, it's been a prejudice system for so long. The whole system has been prejudiced for so long is that you kind of reap what you sow at every. Sure, and the point is you don't get to control. You know, we have these programs in now, which are now all going away in private enterprises and things that said, okay, you should somehow strive to be equitable in the thing. Well, that's all gone now on the thing, but over all these years, that never really happened anyway. All those systems and programs were in place, but nobody really paid any attention to them. They would give lip service, they being all the leaders and all these lip service once in a while, but they never really did. They never really conformed to the guidance on the things. And so you have that. And so it's a problem, but it's not something, you know, one of the difficult things is I don't think you solve it by saying, okay, 14% and 5%. We had to, oh, look, we have to do this. Big blowback, you know. So it's, you know, how you really get this to move is the trouble, you know, how you really get that. Go ahead.
To do a break in the cycle, because back to the truancy thing, I know a family, all their kids are in trouble with the truancy people. I guess it's only one person, but the parents never went to school. Well, there's not a dad, well, there's several dads, you know. And the mom never went to school. None of her brothers and sisters, grandparents, none of them ever graduated from
Sure.
school, and they did just fine. So if the mom doesn't see that as a priority, how do you break that?
Yeah, the comment is, how do you break the cycle of lack of confidence or even enthusiasm about education in the thing? And the answer, that's really, really tough. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's over everywhere you look. We have this, and it's not just here in small town northern Michigan. It's all over. Probably more exacerbated in places that have more diversity. You know, we don't have a lot here, so we don't feel the pinch of it personally as much as you might in some other areas. In Michigan, but the whole attitude, you know, part of this truancy thing and the whole thing is there's been a continuous attitude of diminishing the value of education. Don't need it. Don't need it. Don't need it. I don't need it. You know, I don't need algebra. I don't need this. I don't need that. And that's been going on. Go ahead.
How to counter that, but another twist to that, where you're saying the diversity and so on. I grew up and went to the school downstate, and every single one of my classmates came from a middle class family. We were all
Right.
and then I come up here and teach, and it was a graduate of Alpena Public Schools that came back, one of those recognized people who made the comment about, we don't even realize that we are diverse up here, maybe not with skin color. But since we're the only school, the only high school in the whole county, it's got everybody in that building.
Right.
It's got the children of the whatever Lafarge is now. It's got the lawyers' kids, it's got the country kids, It's got city kids, it's got everybody.
Right.
And when I looked at it that way, it's like, man, and then I thought, and I look over my classroom. It's true. I mean, you got everybody in there.
Right.
So we've got diversity more socioeconomic than, but there is diversity.
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't mean that, but we don't feel the other kind of diversity up here. Yes, we have, and we have it up here in spades, socioeconomic diversity, and it's very, very apparent because we are a small community. So therefore, it's it's very when you get a chance like you do or did in a classroom to see that, then you can actually, most people don't see it. Unless you're in a classroom or in another place like that, you don't see it because it's not apparent in your daily life. You don't see that interaction. You don't see that division in the things, but you do in the classroom or other places. And so it's, yeah, and that's where it's also where we run into all these issues of things. And so really kind of difficult.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Another great program. I don't know how many.
Oh, for crying out loud. Am I your disposal service for these things? Or? Thank you. Thank you.